us have been focused on Iraq and Afghanistan, where the UN, where the United States has been a key protagonist. This morning we're going to ask you to think about those conflicts, but also to think about Congo, a oil-rich country in Africa. A resource-rich country in Africa with gold and coltan. Add to it a little bit of greed, ethnic enmity, political opportunism, militias of very well-armed children. They're both the warriors and key victims. Think about the refugees, the hunger, the disease, the misery that flows at a time when aid agencies are not able to get to them. Think about the developed world's response as it is distracted by the lead-up to Iraq. The French have offered a resolution in the United Nations to send a peacekeeping force. That resolution did pass. Western states agreed to the establishment of a peacekeeping force, but the U.S., like many others, refused to dedicate their own soldiers to keeping the peace. So today we're going to talk a little more about man-made disasters and how they can be prevented. And leading this morning's plenary is Chip Blacker. Chip is the Deputy Director of the Institute for International Studies. He heads up also a new initiative within IIS, which I hope you will say a word about. He's also a former Senior Director of the National Security Council staff. So he brings the perspective both as a scholar and a policymaker. So please welcome Chip Blacker.
Thank you, Jane, very much, and good morning to all of you. Our topic this morning is conflict and development. Wars between states and wars within states have sapped much of the energy and much of the hope for human development in many parts of the world. It's certainly no accident that those regions of the world that have had the most success politically and economically are those that have been least affected by violence. In this plenary session, and again in one of the breakout sessions immediately following, we will examine this problem intensively, close up, and see what non-governmental organizations can do to relieve the effects of violent conflict and to help put in place the foundation for lasting peace. We are extremely pleased to have with us this morning three speakers who have been very busy recently dealing with precisely this issue. Charles MacCormack, who is president of Save the Children, Kenneth Roth, who is the executive director of Human Rights Watch, and Olara, Otunnu, who is the special representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict at the United Nations. So as we begin this morning, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Charles MacCormack.
Thank you, Chip. Good morning, everyone. I want to congratulate you on being here at 8:30 in the morning. We're all very grateful to you. For many years, for our first 40 years, Save the Children did not involve itself in relief, reconstruction, and emergency programs. We saw ourselves as a long-term development organization, and we wanted to focus on long-term structural strategic solutions, and we did not want to put our energy into simply what we looked at as Band-Aid kinds of activities. And we thought focusing on the long term was not only the most effective thing to do, it was the most logical thing for us to do. But more and more, our practical work on the ground showed us that you can't make a distinction between long-term development and conflict and crisis. and we found ourselves more and more often working in countries where we were committed to the long term, but where conflicts were occurring and setting back our work. So in spite of our preferences, we have found ourselves more and more involved in emergency response and conflict mitigation and resolution. When I joined Save the Children 10 years ago, we were working in 7 areas of war and civil strife. Today we're working in 32 countries where there is war and civil strife. So clearly the problem of armed conflict in poor countries is becoming more and more significant. Today there are more than 40 wars and armed conflicts and internal conflicts happening in the world. So it is, I think, impossible to develop a strategy of long-term development without dealing with the issues of conflict. Of the 20 poorest countries in the world, 14 of them today are facing conflict, war, and civil strife. So the interrelationships between long-term development and conflict are really joined at the hip. And we certainly find it more and more difficult to imagine a strategic approach to long-term development without factoring in issues of conflict resolution and conflict mitigation and relief. Obviously, at this time, lots of our attention is focused on Iraq. One week ago, at this moment, Friday morning, a week ago, I was in Baghdad. I spent all of last week in Iraq, in Baghdad, in Basra, and Qasa, wanting to see for myself what the circumstances were and how it all compared to what I was hearing on the news and reading in the newspapers. In some ways, it's a good news, bad news situation. On the good news side, in contrast to places like Afghanistan and southern Sudan and Congo, there's a tremendous cadre of very well-educated professionals, doctors, nurses, engineers, university faculty, that otherwise takes a generation to produce. So that 25 or 30-year process that is necessary in an Afghanistan to produce a nation with an adequate number of professionals just isn't necessary in Iraq. Although interestingly enough, these people are almost all 45 years old or older. For the last 20 years, what was once a very effective system of higher education has really deteriorated. So there are not a lot of young professionals, although the faculty to educate them are still available. In any case, there are more than enough well-educated professionals in Iraq to manage a modern society. Secondly, it has a very sophisticated system of infrastructure, 4 and 6 and 8 lane highways, airports, air traffic control systems, etc., that with some modest repairs can be put back into shape. And last but not least, when the oil industry is back and modernized, they will have between $10 billion and $20 billion a year of revenue for a country with a relatively small population. So it's very easy in many ways to see how Iraq could be a sustainable, modern, well-developed country in 5 to 7 years. The bad news is that the physical infrastructure of the country is certainly wrecked. The amount of looting has been incredible. Every school, every clinic, every university building is just trashed, right down to the wiring inside of the walls. But every desk, every chair, every bed, every bit of pharmaceuticals are gone. And it continues to go on. There's looting every night, there's gunfire every night. And we found ourselves at Save the Children simply by process of elimination thrust into managing and supporting all of the orphanages in southern Iraq, and all of the main towns have orphanages. And the staff all left during the war, they haven't come back yet. The facilities, once again, beds were taken, rugs were taken, sinks were taken, toilets were taken, refrigerators were taken. But when we asked the children whether they wanted us to replace the stoves, for example, because we're also providing food, they said, please don't put a stove in here, just bring all the looters right back in again, and then we're going to be in great danger. So give us a little propane camp stove that we can hide somewhere, because anything of value is just going to be a target for looting. So obviously, physical security and stability, number one, isn't there, and nothing sustainable is going to happen until it's provided. Parents won't send their children to school because they're afraid of kidnappings and gunfights and so on and so forth, so you can't restart the school system. Until you restart the school system, children are out on the streets and running in front of tanks and cars and not having any kind of normalcy in their life, so psychological difficulties are increasing. So the single greatest need in Iraq, in my opinion, is certainly to establish physical security, number one, and then begin rehabilitating the infrastructure, the schools, the clinics, the hospitals, and so on and so forth of the country. And finally, there will be the political challenges. Iraq has been an undemocratic society, a top-down society for probably 5,000 or 6,000 years, actually. And underneath the veneer of authority, there are dozens and dozens of sheikhs and families and extended families that have been rivals in every town and city in the country for centuries. So maintaining stability in that situation is not going to be easy. It's also not easy for the humanitarian organizations like Save the Children, like CARE, like International Rescue Committee, like UNICEF, to be working under a military occupation. The arrangements in Iraq are different than anything that we've had in many decades. In East Timor, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, there's always been a UN administration, there's been a US ambassador, there's been a structure of humanitarianism where we've all learned to work together through trial and error, and I think we've all gotten fairly good with our UN colleagues and our humanitarian colleagues, but that's just not the situation in Iraq. So figuring out how to maintain our autonomy and independence in a situation where 95% of the actual work is being done either by the military or by contractors is a whole new way of functioning. So that's all to say that I think any of us that are interested in a better world in long-term development also have to wrestle with the role of conflict and war in our long-term strategies. And let me say a word or two about how philanthropy can help, because lots of people think, well, since there are billions of dollars being poured into these emergencies, what can private contributions do? First of all, most of these governmental funds are very focused on physical reconstruction, and a lot of the human resource development is not provided for, so you tend to get very skewed responses. But in concluding, let me describe two initiatives, philanthropic initiatives that we have at Save the Children in the area of conflict resolution and conflict mitigation. The Mellon Foundation actually, on its own initiative, provided us with funds for a challenge grant to set up an endowment to allow us to respond to emergencies in the first 48 hours with the earnings from the endowment fund. I think they originally started off with $250,000 and we were to raise another $750,000, but it's gone on and on. The fund is now at $5 million and we expect it to be at $10 million before the next year or two is done. And it allows our people to move out and begin responding when lives are most at risk, not worrying whether or not we're going to be able to raise the private money, because lots of these crises come and go without ever becoming anything that people contribute to. So that's allowed us literally to save thousands and thousands and thousands of lives over the past 2 or 3 years that would not have been possible. Secondly, with the Tim Worth United Nations Foundation and the Donna Karen Foundation and Hearst, we have launched a campaign for the protection of women and children in our conflict to generate $45 million a year from the U.S. Congress to provide much greater protection for women and children in our conflict. In 1900, 90% of the victims of armed conflict were combatants or military people. In the year 2000, 90% of the victims of armed conflict were civilians, mainly women and children. It's much safer today to be a soldier than to be a mother in a war zone. So this funding from the private sector has allowed us to do this kind of advocacy that's just not possible with any kind of public fund. So there's a real role for philanthropy and conflict resolution, and I hope everyone will give that some thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now we turn to Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch. Ken.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let me say just a brief word about Human Rights Watch first. We have been around for 25 years. We work in about 70 countries around the world. And we tend to work in countries where there is no functioning legal system. So you can't go to court to protect your rights. Instead, what we've done is develop an alternative way of protecting rights, which is geared at putting pressure on the political branches of government rather than appealing to judges. We do that by having investigators on our staff who either live in the country in question or travel there regularly, speaking to victims and witnesses of human rights abuse and putting together as comprehensive, objective picture as they can of the human rights practices in that country. And we then issue reports based on their findings, probably about 2 reports a week. And we use these reports as the beginning of a campaign to put pressure on the government, which usually involves 2 parts. One is shaming the government, putting a spotlight on its abuses, because every government, even Saddam Hussein, tries to hide their human rights abuses. And by exposing that, you shame them, you embarrass the government, you delegitimize it before its people and before its peers, which can be very powerful pressure. We also will work with sympathetic, influential governments or institutions to try to put diplomatic or economic pressure on a government. So, a military aid package or an arms sale might be conditioned on a government taking steps to improve its human rights practices. We also have been involved in a number of global campaigns focused particularly on conflict with the aim of mitigating the consequences of conflict. So, for example, Human Rights Watch was one of the lead groups behind the campaign to ban the use of anti-personnel landmines. And the coalition that we helped to form actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for that effort. A treaty has now been adopted, which well over 100 governments have ratified. Human Rights Watch has also played a lead role in promoting the treaty to ban the use of children as soldiers, which again is now in the process of being broadly ratified. We were one of the lead organizations behind the creation of the new International Criminal Court, which is like a global war crimes tribunal for the worst human rights offenders around the world. These are all designed to try to mitigate the consequences of conflict for the civilian population that often suffers so much. And I should say that my organization spends about a third of its time in war zones, and the rest of the time in more classic situations of which I call peacetime repression. Now, the topic this morning is conflict and development. And to put this in perspective, I think yesterday we spoke mostly about giving money, about aid. And today, as I understand it, the conversation shifts more to the conditions in which it's possible to receive aid. So the flip side of the coin. Conflict and development, in a sense, are polar opposite sides of the spectrum. If you're in a situation of conflict, you're not going to have development. If you're in a situation where a country is developing, odds are you move beyond conflict. So what I'd like to address in my very brief 10 minutes is how does the government end up on one side of the spectrum or another? Or perhaps more important, how do you move governments from a tendency toward conflict toward a tendency toward the peace that you need in order to develop? In my simplified version that I need to unfortunately present here, let me divide the world into two parts, what you might call abusive governments and accountable governments. Now, I'm going to give you a package view here. This is simplified, I apologize, but you have to do what you have to do here. An abusive government has a number of attributes that I think many of you will recognize. It tends to be secret. It likes to have closed books. It doesn't like people looking at touching things like its revenue or its expenditures. It tends to be corrupt because that secrecy facilitates corruption. It tends to have a rentier economy rather than an entrepreneurial economy because it doesn't want a middle class, a competing power center. It's perfectly happy living off the natural resources, which in a closed society, it's able to control itself and siphon a significant amount of revenue off to arms purchases or the Swiss bank account or what have you. It tends to silence the opposition because naturally the public in a country like this doesn't want its government stealing its resources. And so opposition arises and it needs to be suppressed. An abusive government tends to undermine the rule of law because it doesn't want to be caught or punished for its corruption. It doesn't want to be constrained in its resort to violence to suppress opposition. But of course there are long-term consequences as well, because if there's not the rule of law, you tend to have more private violence as well. Things like domestic violence can be on the rise. Abuses against displaced people or refugees. AIDS spreads more widely because women don't have the same resort to law enforcement and thus are more susceptible to unsafe sex. Abusive governments tend to generate war because there is an opposition in any country. But if there are not peaceful avenues to change, people tend to take up arms. Abusive governments tend to fight abusive wars, naturally. They don't have a tradition of abiding by the law, so they tend not to follow things like the Geneva Conventions. And so their wars are worse for civilians who happen to be nearby. Needless to say, abusive governments tend not to attract very much international assistance because development projects are often misconceived. There is not the opportunity to consult with the general population to see what are their needs. Abusive governments tend to pick development projects that serve the government's needs. And last, abusive governments are a poor investment for the private sector because the economy is stultified. There are no legal protections for your investment. Corruption minimizes profits. All in all, it's not a great place to put your capital. So this all adds up to abusive governments not developing, not being a very good place for economic development for their people. Now the flip side of the coin you might call an accountable government. Here there is a vigorous civil society that scrutinizes governmental practices. tries to make sure that they in fact reflect popular priority, try to ensure that government officials are there to serve the people rather than to serve their pocketbooks. Accountable governments have the rule of law. That means that not only are ordinary citizens subject to the law, but so are government officials. That, of course, reduces corruption and requires that governments reduce arbitrary violence and otherwise subscribe to the standards of their people. Accountable governments have periodic elections, so you can actually change the government if you're not happy with the direction it's going. Now, what are the consequences of having an accountable government? Well, corruption tends to be down because, as I said, government officials are subject to the rule of law. Development projects tend to be determined by public debate rather than official edict, and so they're more likely to reflect the priorities and needs of the people. Both official and private violence will tend to be down because there is a police force that is responsive to trying to stop that violence rather than just serve to perpetuate the power of the rulers. Natural resources, when there are significant resources in a country, tend to be exploited for the popular benefit. The revenues are publicly accountable and go into the official budget rather than into the unofficial Swiss bank account. And accountable governments tend to be a good investment climate because private capital has confidence that first, the capital will be preserved, and second, there's a reasonable prospect for investment. And of course, accountable governments tend to attract international development assistance. So the real question is, how do you move from an abusive government to an accountable government? How do you move from an Angola to a Mozambique, from a Congo to a Senegal? The key is local pressure. In every one of these countries, there are local groups, popular organizations that want accountable government. But of course, one of the points of abusive government is to suppress those groups. And here is where the international community has a particular role to play. It is possible, by enlisting the powerful governments and institutions of the world, to begin to put pressure on abusive governments to become more open and more accountable. Let me name even a few unpopular institutions to show that even some of the often perceived bad guys can do some good things in this area. For example, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has been putting pressure on Angola through something called the oil diagnostic, insisting that Angola account for its oil revenue publicly, something that it, so far, is resisting. But it is not getting its additional IMF loans until it takes the basic step of publishing its revenue. A simple practice, I think, but one that it doesn't want to do. The World Bank, in the case of the Chad-Cameroon pipeline, has taken things one step further. It has required Chad, when these revenues come online, not only to publish the amount that it receives, but also to ensure that civil society has a role in distributing this new income in a way that serves the human needs of the Chadian population. The World Bank also increasingly is insisting on popular participation in the formulation of development projects, so that projects are both best attuned to the needs of the population served by the World Bank. Increasingly, private businesses are also recognizing that they cannot afford to be complicit in human rights abuse without sacrificing their reputation. And so they are beginning to adopt codes of conduct to ensure that, at least in their operations and the operations of their suppliers, that there are oases of freedom where people can form labor unions who are not facing discrimination on grounds of gender or race or ethnicity, where there is not arbitrary violence used. The US government and the European Union increasingly are conditioning their aid on governments taking steps to permit civil society, to permit basic freedom, to support the rule of law. Now, there are counterexamples to every one of these that I gave, where each of these institutions is doing the wrong thing, it's continuing to send aid without regard to human rights conditions in the country that is the beneficiary. Indeed, none of these advances that I've outlined would have been possible without pressure from international civil society. So, how can you affect this? Well, in each of these cases, there are organizations like Human Rights Watch and my colleague organizations that work in these countries that document the link between abuse of government conflict and movement on the spectrum from development toward war. We are there to highlight places where governments ignore the rule of law, where governments repress civil society, where governments engage in abuse of war. And as I mentioned, by documenting this carefully, by exposing these abuses, by shaming governments, by putting economic pressure on governments, we can move governments. This is not an impossible task. I can give you dozens upon dozens of cases in which governments have moved because of pressure of this sort. So my appeal to you as philanthropists is that when you think about promoting development, don't fight with one hand behind your back. It's not enough just to give money directly to a country or a project you need. You also need to pay attention to the conditions in which that aid might be received. It's not enough to provide direct services. You also need to be concerned about the policies that will allow those direct services to flourish for the betterment of the recipients. Many people think that this is somehow inappropriate for private philanthropy, that this might be too policy-oriented or too political. And I just want to assure you, Human Rights Watch and many other organizations like us are 501c3 corporations. It is perfectly appropriate for private foundations to give in areas of this sort. And indeed, I would go one step further. There is a specific need for private philanthropy to be involved here. Because while governments very frequently are providing the direct services, governments are not dependable for dealing with policy questions. You need institutions that are independent of government, because frankly, governments are often the problem. Governments need to be pressured. For that reason, my organization does not take 1 cent of government money. We rely exclusively on private philanthropy. And as you think about what your overall giving budget would look like, my appeal to you is to leave room for this concern with the conditions that will make direct assistance most useful for the people who stand to benefit. Thank you.
Ken, thank you very much for your remarks. I think it's about as concise and articulate an expression of what your organization does and what other organizations like it do that I've heard. We now turn to our third panelist before we open it up for Q&A, and that is Olara Otunnu from the United Nations.
I'm hungry. I guess that this must be my friend Hernando the Socialist Apple. Although I don't see any documentary evidence. Don't worry, I won't illustrate my talk with this, I'm just hungry. But thank you very much, Hernando, for that truly magisterial presentation yesterday. Children suffer the worst in any situation of war. But until recently, their faith, their protection, their well-being was either ignored altogether or largely marginalized. It is thanks to the work of my friend and hero, Graça Machel, that this situation has started to change over the last several years. Indeed, she should be the one standing here to make this presentation and not myself. Thank you very much, Graça, for the groundbreaking work that you've done. When we speak of the impact of armed conflict on children, there are several dimensions to this impact. There are children who are outright killed and maimed, children displaced within their countries and across borders, children who are left with deep psychosocial trauma as a result of exposure to war, children separated from their families, Increasingly, we are seeing organized sexual violence, especially targeting girls, as a stratagem of war. And we are seeing children losing out on health and on schooling. And we are seeing this most cynical of all practices, which is the use, the exploitation of children to fight the wars of adults. Children being used as child soldiers. These are some of the aspects of the impact of war on children. The scope of this problem is worldwide. There is no continent untouched by this phenomenon. As we meet here, there are probably at least 30 countries in which conflicts, armed conflicts, full-blown armed conflicts are unfolding. If we add to these countries where the guns are formally gone silent, but where the legacy of war continues to hurt and haunt children, is more than 50 countries we are speaking about in the world. And we're talking about millions of children. And children, for these purposes, by the way, as many of you will know, any young person below the age of 18, that's what the Convention on Rights of the Child provides, and that's what most domestic jurisdiction provides. Now, there are particular features of today's conflict that makes children suffer disproportionately. In particular, conflicts that are unfolding within national borders. Conflicts where the war leaders utilize religion, ethnicity, region, race to mobilize for war. Conflicts which last not just days and weeks and years, but quite often they go on for decades. Look at Colombia, Angola, Sri Lanka, Chechnya. And conflicts in which there's no division anymore between civilians and soldiers, in which one is fighting so-called enemy community. And once you define the enemy as a community, the better to target children, women, the elderly, the non-combatants. And conflicts in which small arms especially flow like water along porous national borders. These are some of the features of today's conflict typically that expose children to disproportionate suffering. What has been the response, the action that has been mobilized over the last several years? We've been working at the United Nations with NGOs and civil societies to reverse this trend which I've just been describing. First, by creating greater public and official awareness about what we do to our children in situations of conflict, and use the base of that awareness to mobilize for action, political action and material support. We've also been working to strengthen the international regime in terms of standards, rules, and norms for protecting children in situations of conflict. And now I think we've got in place a very impressive body of such norms, going from the provisions in the Rome Statute to the optional protocol, the Convention on Rights of the Child, the resolutions of the Security Council, the ILO Convention, a long list of very impressive body of norms devoted to the protection of children in situations of conflict. We've also been working to engage the attention and have them adopt policies and programs and advocacy of policy-making bodies. The United Nations Security Council, which has now made the protection of children, well-being of children, an integral part of the peace and security agenda of the international community. The G8, the European Parliament, the African Union, OSCE, and other policy-making organizations. I have, and with colleagues in the NGO community, visited situations of conflict. We just heard the example of Charlie County. In the middle of ongoing conflict, engaging and challenging parties in conflict directly to live up to their obligations and responsibility relative to the protection of children. and to use the base of commitments they have made to generate pressure for them to observe and apply the commitments that they have made. And of course, in post-conflict situations like Iraq today, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, to work to ensure that any post-conflict programs of reconstruction and healing do not shortchange children. That children become, their well-being, their development, their education, their health, their nutrition becomes a central aspect of any post-conflict program of reconstruction and healing. Where we are now, the main and central challenge I see for all of us within the international community is how together to embark on what one might call an era of application. We have in place a very impressive body of norms and rules and standards. We know what needs to be done. They are accepted. How do we proceed to ensure that they are taken seriously on the ground by those whose actual impact on children? One, we need to make sure that these norms, international norms, as well as local norms, norms which are grown in local soil with regard to the protection of non-combatants, especially children, that they are better known in a campaign of dissemination and a campaign of sensibilization. Secondly, with the very impressive body of standards we have in place, we should now embark on a more systematic way to monitor and report on the conduct of parties in conflict relative to the protection of children. Verse and chapter. Who is using landmines? Who's attacking schools and hospitals? Who is maiming children? Who's recruiting and using children as child soldiers? We have now begun an exercise, by the way, in the Security Council. Last year, the Security Council issued a report which for the first time named explicitly parties in conflict that continue to abuse children in situations of conflict. We need to do this more systematically. And then, it is very important that we work to develop networks of civil society for protection and advocacy at the local level, within countries and within sub-regions. They are the frontline people to struggle for the protection of children in situations of conflict. We need the participation of young people themselves. We've just developed now in Sierra Leone, and we're working to develop this in other countries, and we hope with your support we can do more, what we call the voice of children. These are radio programs and radio stations, largely, but television as well, devoted to and for the benefit of children. And by and large, children themselves who produce these programs, telling their stories, entertainment, advice about health and education and family matters, and dialoguing with adults. We've seen this now in Sierra Leone. It's a remarkable experiment, and we hope to expand this further. We must ensure, as we've been able to do in the context of the Northern Ireland Peace Accord, the Good Friday Peace Accord, the peace accord concerning Sierra Leone, the peace accord concerning Burundi, that whenever people sit down to discuss the ending of conflict and to chart post-conflict dispensation, that the concerns of children, their well-being and their protection is inscribed and provided for in these accords as a systematic matter. And finally, I repeat that in post-conflict situations like Iraq today, we must make sure that we invest in children and in youth. There is simply no better way to invest in the development of a country and in long-term peace than investing in the young people. They are, in many of these situations, they are crossroads. The young people can go either way. They can become the most enthusiastic, constructive, positive force for reconciliation and construction. Or if they are neglected, ignored, they become embittered, alienated, and they become a battalion, an army to undo whatever peace is being put in place. The choice is ours, and that depends on whether we choose to invest in young people or not. Let me say finally that we in the international community are well placed to reverse definitively the trend of abomination that one could describe here for hours. And the main asset we have is the fact, the inescapable fact of interdependence in today's world. There's no fighting group, no warlord, no government leader that does not care today what international public opinion thinks of what they are doing on the ground once exposed. We must use the court of international public opinion to hold accountable these people. There is no group in the world today that can execute or prosecute a war on its own without relying on the cooperation, in some cases collaboration of the wider international community to provide arms, to buy often illicitly gold, diamond, oil, coltrane to finance the war effort. There's no group fighting that tomorrow from Sri Lanka to Sierra Leone to Iraq doesn't want to sit down and discuss about being prime minister and being president when the peace negotiations come. Part of their legitimacy in the end depends on acceptance by the international community. All these provide crucial levers of influence that we can use to protect children, if we would like to use that capital for the benefit of children. We are in a position to reverse this trend and provide a world that is safer for our children, all our children from Iraq to Sierra Leone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olara. We're now going to open it up for questions and short comments. We have mobile microphones that we will bring to you. Just two rules. One, would you please identify yourself at the outset? And two, please indicate to whom your question is addressed. And I'll start on my left, and I'll just work my way around the room. Yes, ma'am.
My name's Jenny Yancey. I'm with New Visions, and I'm really excited to hear each of your presentations today. I'm also, though, just as concerned about the lack of opportunity in this country to hear such presentations on a much broader and a much wider level for people in this country who are involved in civil society to be able to play much more of a concerted effort to have more impact in the world. And I feel that we in this country have not only one arm tied behind our back, but two, because we do not choose to use more of a platform of media and exposure for our own people and our own civil society in this country to more intentionally have an impact abroad. So my question is, how do you view, do we have one or two arms tied behind our back in this context, and how you might suggest we move forward in the future?
Would you like all three of them to comment, or do you have one in particular?
I'll leave it open to who would like to choose to comment. Thank you.
You're absolutely right that press in this country tends to be very parochial, and it's probably moving in the wrong direction. Many bureaus, international bureaus, are being cut back. I think that the challenge for us is to try to demonstrate why even a appropriately tending American public needs to be concerned about these issues overseas. I think a good place to begin is the war on terrorism, where there's a tendency to, I think for many Americans, to say, do whatever it takes to protect me. I just don't want to hear about anything else. And I think that we need to demonstrate that the approach that this country is taking to fighting terrorism has become counterproductive. That by fighting a war in which we are often quite indifferent to human rights matters. We find ourselves in league with the abusive warlords in Afghanistan, or trying to prevent efforts to hold the abusive Indonesian military accountable, or we're fighting efforts to hold Russia accountable before the UN for its abuses in Chechnya, or China for its abuses in Xinjiang. That this is coming back to haunt us, that is breeding resentment around the world, that is making it much less likely for people to cooperate in fighting terrorism, and in fact is becoming perhaps the main recruiting incentive for Al-Qaeda. There are arguments like this that need to be made to show that if we don't pay attention to the external world, that our tomb is going to be punctured, and that it is not enough to just cede this territory to government at this point.
I would certainly, I want to agree with your point, agree with Ken. There is an increasing tension, as I see it, between what in fact is increased attentiveness among Americans in regard to what's going on in the world after 9/11, and there have been lots of research that says people are in fact paying more attention, reading more, tuning in more on the one hand, but the increasing homogeneity of what they're seeing. And you literally, I mean, our people in Iraq tune into the BBC in order to find out what's happening, even though they can get CNN and MSNBC and Fox and so on, but they're all saying exactly the same thing. So the American public is not getting a broad spectrum of information, and it's a huge problem.
Yes, sir. Microphone. I'm sorry. Right.
Wayne Jaquith. Just pursuing the same subject, it seems now that any American service person or American media sustaining a casualty gets the kind of coverage that used to be reserved for a president in a state funeral. And yet we get no coverage at all of Iraqi casualties. And during the war, even the Al Jazeera site that had pictures of Iraqi casualties was hacked so that people couldn't get that kind of information. I was just in Europe, and there's speculation here that maybe as many as 5,000 to 7,000 people have been killed after the conflict in Iraq. And I was wondering if Charles or one of the other speakers have a sense of what the casualties were in Iraq. And are you, as NGOs, under pressure and working with these military commanders or ex-military commanders and contractors not to publicize what's going on there as a condition for continued cooperation with your operations?
I don't think anyone has any idea of what the Iraqi casualties of the war were. They probably never will know, but it will certainly take a significant period of time of talking with families and interviewing and so on and so forth. So no one seems to have a clue on in terms of what the casualties are. The media coverage is very limited. I found the situation of children in Iraq to be more severe than what we read about. Not surprisingly, it's the poor, the most isolated 25% of the population that live in poor and violent neighborhoods, that live in isolated communities that don't have the wherewithal to be provided with food aid and so on and so forth. And yet that's not reported because it takes more work to get to these places than most of the media are interested in. And second, it's dangerous. So I think for those reasons there is a hidden crisis in Iraq that's not reported.
Charlie's asking about it.
It's very difficult to know the total number killed. But Human Rights Watch just had 7 people in Iraq doing what we do after every war, which is a simple bomb damage assessment. And we, on the one hand, try to determine the numbers, and we may be able to come up with numbers. We're still kind of doing the calculations. But almost more important, I think, yes, more important, is to find out why people. And one of the things we've been most concerned about is cluster bombs. After the Yugoslav war, we did a bomb damage assessment, and we found out that a quarter of the civilians who died because of the NATO bombing died because NATO used cluster bombs near populated areas. These are the only dumb weapons that the U.S. Air Force was still using near populated areas. Everything else was precision weapons. And so we went to the Pentagon at that stage, to the Air Force in particular, and said, this exception has just got to stop. And we had a fairly lengthy dialogue with them. And when Afghanistan came around, they did stop.
the Air Force did not use cluster bombs near populated areas in Afghanistan, except for 3 exceptions, and 2 of them seemed to have been a mistake. So there was a radical change in practice because the lessons were learned from Yugoslavia. Unfortunately, we go to Iraq, and what my team has found is that on the one hand, the Air Force continued not to use cluster bombs near populated areas in Iraq. They used them in the desert against military concentrations, but near towns, they didn't. Unfortunately, the Army did use cluster bombs, and they used them extensively around Baghdad, Basra, Nasiriyah, Hilla, and many, many people died as a result. And what seems to have happened is that while the Air Force learned the lesson, the Army wasn't involved at all in Yugoslavia. There were no ground troops in Yugoslavia. The Army was barely involved in Afghanistan, just special forces. So this was the first war since the Gulf War that the Army fought. And it used not cluster bombs, because the Army doesn't drop bombs. It used cluster munitions shot by artillery shells. And there is a desperate need for, whoever's up at the top, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, etc., to tell the Army the lesson that we all know the Air Force has learned. The failure to learn that lesson in time is, I think, going to be the major cause of Iraqi civilian casualties once we do the analysis.
Thank you both very much. In the back, I see.
Barnett Barron Asia Foundation. I have a very practical question for Charlie MacCormack. As you well know, in September 2001, the White House issued Executive Order 13224, which prohibits the provision of material aid to terrorist organizations, to organizations owned or controlled by terrorist organizations, or to others otherwise associated with terrorist organizations. And for the first time, humanitarian assistance and medical supplies were included in the prohibited materials. How does Save the Children deal with this in areas of conflict? How do you deal with it in Gaza, Bosnia, Chechnya, Afghanistan, and Iraq, where one side of the conflict are named terrorist organizations?
Well, Barnett, as you know so well, it's in the end literally impossible for us to carry out those regulations. No matter how hard we would try, we don't have the capabilities. We would have to become an intelligence organization in order to seriously vet all the partners and individuals and so on and so forth with whom we work. So somehow either more work is going to be done on finding some middle ground, because obviously we don't want to be directly supporting terrorist organization on the one hand, but we can't go around assuring that every child and family with whom we work is not connected with a terrorist organization. So it'll bring all our work to a halt if these regulations are not improved.
From the front here.
Yes, good morning. Robert Garner, Fauna and Flora International. And I have a comment as well as a question. Armed conflict in terms of poverty alleviation and at least conservation, we see are inextricably linked, particularly coming out of armed conflict. There's a very small opportunity to actually convince governments and organizations to take an effect of preserving natural resources before they are extracted immediately. We've seen 2 success stories in Rwanda of preserving mountain gorillas, as well as in the Cardamom Mountains of Cambodia of convincing the government that making the Cardamom Mountains a World Heritage Site so that they would get more multilateral funding before it was all logged out, were inextricably linked. And I'd just like to ask the panel as well how they feel about partnering more with environmental organizations as well as human rights in these types of situations. There's just such a small window of opportunity after conflicts end.
I think that there is a very natural partnership that exists between environmental groups and human rights groups at a number of levels, not only during conflict. If you look at, for example, some of the major causes of corporate contribution to environmental disasters have been from unaccountable corporations. And as you convince corporations to be more socially responsible, that tends to help both human rights and the environment. If you stress the importance of not being complicit in various forms of exploitation, you begin to get corporations that don't suppress popular opposition, that respect the rights of local villages to have a say in their environment, etc. So that's one way of addressing the problem. In the middle of conflict, often the worst kind of environmental problems come when you have a local armed group that is exploiting natural resources in order to fund an insurgency. And sometimes that may take less environmentally damaging forms if maybe they're just exploiting diamonds or something. But a lot of times it's timber or things that have a direct effect on the environment. And one of the things that Human Rights Watch has been working on is to try to find ways of constraining the ability of armed groups to exploit in often an environmentally abusive way natural resources. And we have to recognize that there has to be a funding base for rebel groups. And that funding base often comes at the expense both of the local population, which has to deal with the arbitrary violence, but also of the environment. So I think that there are very natural partnerships that increasingly are being forged between the environmental and the human rights movement on these kinds of issues.
Two points. The one is that we need to couple environmental concern with preserving the natural resources integrity of various countries. We see increasingly a link, the following link, that the more a country is blessed with natural resources, with gold, oil, coltan, diamond, coffee, timber, the more its people, especially its children, are going to be destroyed. Look at Angola, Sierra Leone, DRC Congo. These are not accidental places, that they're the well-endowed places of natural resources, and because of the natural resources, the children are suffering particularly, and the resources are being used to fund war, which aggresses and oppresses the people. So we need to make that link. The second point I'd like to make is that usually in post-conflict situations, we find after protracted warfare, within the families a chronic phenomenon of poverty. And the key out of that poverty passes through the woman. And women taking initiatives to organize cooperatives, societies, begin certain productive activities to bring to the family income, which makes it possible to release children to go back to school instead of being on the streets. And it's a critical link, how to reach women, empower them, give them certain income, which reaches the family and therefore reaches the children.
Thank you. This will have to be the last question.
Edwards with Stanford University and with a project called Mobile Media, which is about identifying, linking the unidentified people to social services using PDAs to collect that information on their needs. My question is for Ken and for Olara. Your work is very dependent upon information, particularly who is abused and by whom. Could you speak to what challenges, the key challenge that you're facing in that, gathering that information, exposing what's out there, and what would it be, security issues, the privacy, security of the investigators?
Well, there are obviously two dimensions to this. I mean, one, how do you get the information? Two, how do you disseminate it? The safety of our researchers is a major concern because we have people operating in basically every war zone on Earth, virtually every repressive government, we will have people there. And we spend a lot of our time trying to minimize that risk. On the one hand, we don't have to be the photojournalists, the people who are right there, as the shooting is happening. It's enough for us to speak to somebody who was right there. And so that gives us a little bit of safety. But we also do a variety of things like, trying to travel, never travel alone, try to travel, during daytime hours if it's in the middle of a war. Sometimes you have to fly rather than drive. Working very closely with local NGOs who are, critical partners in this on not only security but also a range of strategic issues. So this is a big preoccupation in terms of collecting the information safely. Human Rights Watch has been fortunate in that we've never lost one of our researchers. People have been, arrested, beaten up, but nothing more seriously. But our movement is in constant danger. There regularly are about a dozen people killed a year who are human rights defenders in various countries. And in a sense, Human Rights Watch is fortunate. Being an international organization, we have that degree of protection. Getting the word out is obviously always a challenge. We, with the advent of the internet and the web, it's much easier. We have 40,000 unique visitors to our website every day. We have another 50,000 people who subscribe to our free listservs, which I welcome everybody to do. It's hrw.org, and just sign up, where you get bulletins every day. We use these to get the information out on a real-time basis to press around the world. And we always want more, but we're also pleased with what we're getting. I mean, we typically, our work is cited about 200 times a week in the major media around the world. So people are paying attention. The issue is, to kind of maximize that pressure so that governments are forced to respond to it.
Well, just to add to what Ken has said, as I indicated earlier in my remarks, I believe that among the key challenges we need to address is how to better monitor and report on what parties in conflict are doing to children, verse and chapter. And that we are now well placed to do so, because at the ground level, at the front line, there are people who know. Local NGOs, communities of faith, teachers, parents, women associations, they are there. They know what is going on. We need to partner with them so that the information that they have can be channeled to the international level, made known and publicized, the naming and shaming, if you like. But it's equally important that this information should serve as a trigger for action. It's no use if the information is available, but then it doesn't trigger something, which is why it is important to get organs like the Security Council of the United Nations, the European Parliament, the US government, key NGOs, to make it part of their vocation to act, to bring pressure to bear, to use their influence to lean on the parties in conflict once they have reliable information available to them. Can I say just two other things? One is, I believe that the fight against terrorism, which is a crucial fight, has to in part take into account the particular situation of young people. Young people who are not attending school, who have no prospects of jobs, are naturally vulnerable to being recruited and manipulated by any groups. And so investing in young people, giving them a purpose, hope, giving them productive activities to engage in, has to be one of the more fundamental aspects of our struggle against terrorism across the globe, but especially in places where terrorism has fertile soil. And then the last point I'd like to make is that we also need to pay a good deal of attention to the phenomenon of manipulation. Most of the conflicts we speak about don't arise naturally. They don't come from the natural air or the natural soil. I was in Congo not very long ago, Bunia, the place where a lot of massacre has been taking place, and we read in the papers about the Lendu fighting the Hema. It is not true. I met with elders of both communities together, not separately. They described to me at length what kind of relationship they've had for centuries, and how outside forces who have intervened in the Congo, in their region, have manipulated the diversity within this region, armed one group, then disarmed another one, and created another militia, another group to serve their own purposes, and with the local people paying the price. The aspect of manipulation, manipulation of ethnicity, of religion, manipulation in order to gain access to natural resources and enrichment, we need to pay a good deal more attention to this and highlight this in our work than we do up till now.
Thank you, Olara. I've been asked to announce or to take note of the fact that this conversation regarding conflict and development will continue in one of the breakout sessions after your break. On behalf of the conference organizers and sponsors, on behalf of the Global Philanthropy Forum, I'd like to thank Charlie MacCormack, Ken Roth, and Olara Otunnu for taking time out of their schedules to share their experience and their wisdom with us this morning. We will now take a short break, shorter than indicated on your schedule, in part because we've run over, but I'm not complaining about that. I think it's testament to the quality of the discussion. The first round of the breakout sessions, it says in my script, will start promptly at 10 a.m. in Fisher Hall. I don't know how promptly that 10 a.m. will be, but that's the formal word. Like yesterday, the breakout sessions will be down the hall from here. Signs will be posted to guide you and also members of the staff. We will reconvene after the second round of breakout sessions here in this room at 1 p.m. The featured speaker will be John Morgridge of the Global Philanthropy Forum. He'll be speaking on corporate social responsibility. Let me make one more announcement. If I can have your attention, please. Thank you. I'd like to draw your attention to the feedback form that's on the back of the program. If you haven't done so, please take a moment to complete the form and drop it in the box that is at the registration desk in the lobby. This is very important for conference organizers as they start planning for the third annual conference. So please do that. And again, please join me in thanking our speakers this morning.